Hello, everyone. Welcome to this segment. Today, we have my good friend Margaret. Hi, Margaret. Thank you for joining us. And then also,
Hey.
we have my other friend, Araya Williams. She is the owner of Sunshine Interpreting. She is awesome, and I've gotten the chance to talk to her about this idea that I've had for a long time. And she's been giving me advice, and we've been talking through ideas about this. So she's great. Thank you, Araya, for joining us today as well.
Sure.
Fun fact. So, teen was when I started taking ASL classes in college. And I started taking ASL classes, and during our class, we had a tutor. His name was Sam. And my professor would be like, "Hey guys, if you guys need help with tutoring, reach out to Sam, and you guys can, like practice for your exams and things like that with him." So I was like, okay. So I met up with Sam frequently in the library, and I got the chance to like hear his story and things like that, and it was awesome. And then a few years later, I want to say 2022, I think, I met Margaret through my friend Amanda. Amanda and I went to Abilene Christian University together. And I met up with her for coffee. And this was right before the first Awaken conference in 2022. And she was like, "Hey, you're going to the conference, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "Oh, my roommate will be there. My roommate Margaret will be there. You should like, meet her. Like she's really awesome." I'm like, okay. So then after the conference, like I got to meet Margaret, and like now we're friends, and this is so cool. But she's awesome. And like we went out for coffee one time, and then she was asking me, "Hey, Lydia, how did you take ASL classes? Like, where did you learn? All of these things." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I took it at University of North Texas in Denton." She was like, "Oh, okay. Who was your tutor?" And I said, "Oh, his name was Sam." And then she goes, "Sam? Like, we grew up together. Like, I've known Sam since like we were kids." And I was like, "What?" And then she pulled out a picture of them when they were little kids. And I was like, "That's my tutor, and that's Margaret. Like, how cool is this?" So like God is just wild in the ways like he places people in our lives, and the ways things happen. Like even thinking about it, like I'm tearing up right now. Like God is so good. Thank you, Margaret, for joining us today, and thank you, Araya, for your help with interpreting.
Thank you for having me here.
Do you mind sharing your story with us? Like, were you born deaf? Were you born hearing? Did you grow up in a Christian family? What did going to church look like? Were you born a Christian? If not, when did you meet Jesus? What did you have an interpreter? What was experiencing Jesus growing up like for you?
So, I was born deaf. My parents didn't find out I was deaf until I was about the age of 2. And it's at that point that I got a cochlear implant, started to learn sign language as well as speaking. So I was learning both at the same time, speaking English and sign language. Fortunately, I did grow up in a Christian home. My parents regularly attended church, and I grew up. My upbringing was good. It was a good environment. My parents tried the best they could to teach me Christian values. Unfortunately, my church growing up did not provide interpreters, and so it was really um, in that setting, I missed a lot of information. It was just a surface level that I could keep up with in the stories, like the story of Jonah and the whale was like, a children's story, and children are learning about these things in Sunday school. And it was hard for me then to really have an in-depth relationship with Jesus because I only knew the context in a superficial level. I didn't have anybody to really teach me or explain the details, and certainly not explain it enough. So church for me was just social time. It was not as much learning about Jesus because I didn't have access. I didn't have an interpreter. And so I didn't really care much about my relationship with God in that sense. So, yeah, that I would say caused a lot of just dis-ease in me. I wondered often, why did God make me deaf? If I was lacking this relationship with Him, like if if the church wants deaf people there, which they said they did, but they weren't providing interpreters, it just didn't align for me. And I wanted God to use me. And I wondered, how would I communicate with others? How can I be used by God without communication? How would God use me in mission work? And this was a long period of time that I really felt this way. It was not until my senior year of high school, I remember distinctly this, I don't know, I want to call it this moment of realization. I'm going to college soon. I won't have my parents there to encourage me to be going to church. I'll be making my own decisions. And I was in this kind of decision making of, do I want to follow Jesus in college or not? I had friends that had already attended the ministries at the college I was going to, and they started inviting me to these, and I was amazed, like that they had interpreters at these settings, and at this church in particular, I was actually more passionate to go to church, knowing that they had access provided. It made it easier for me to attend and go to church, engage that way. So I was regularly attending and engaged and just jumped right in. And I, at that point, realized how much I really had missed out on growing up. It was truly an amazing experience. Being involved in that church in college led me then to get to experience a mission trip. We went to San Francisco, California, and there was a group of us working, um, doing an outreach for the homeless community, those experiencing homelessness, and we would do some street evangelism as well. And I remember during this trip feeling a little uneasy because I was the only deaf individual on this mission trip. They did provide an interpreter, but I didn't really know how to share the gospel because no one ever really taught me. So that missions trip, I felt like, of course, God was with me the whole time. And he was really showing me that he can use me. And there was one of those days that we went out as a group, and it was in one of the locations where they were serving food. And I was speaking with a woman that was there, and she told me that there's a deaf person that occasionally comes, but that she hadn't seen this deaf person for about 3 or 4 months. And I was like, interesting. Okay, well, maybe I could pray that God would allow me to meet this person and allow me to reach out to them. So I was praying, and I was maybe an hour or so later. I couldn't believe it. This deaf person actually showed up. I was shocked. And it was like, wow, God really answered my prayer that quickly. And it was so impactful to me to just think, wow, I was able to share the gospel in my heart language of ASL. And it was just so cool. So cool that God showed me like deafness isn't a barrier. You have opportunities to share the gospel regardless of your deafness. And it wasn't just that situation, getting to share with that deaf person who was experiencing homelessness, but there was other people, hearing people I was able to share with as well, because I had the interpreter with me, and that allowed me to then have access to the information that there was no communication barriers. The communication that was happening around me was being interpreted, and that moment, that mission trip in particular, really showed me that regardless of the situation, God can still use me. And I see often throughout my life, this has been a theme. Oh, God, surely, most definitely, deeply cares. I'm deaf for a reason. And I'm truly grateful, grateful for the chance to share the gospel in my heart language. So college was a season for me of truly making my own decision of really following Jesus. And I made the decision to get rebaptized during that season, because I more fully understood what it meant to be baptized at this point. So that was really cool to get rebaptized and with a fuller, deeper understanding of what it meant that time around. Yeah, there you go.
Shared this story with me before, and it just gets powerful every time you share it. But when you feel in those moments when you feel like God can't use you, no matter whatever your limitations are, God surprises you and he shows up and he's able to, use all of us. We have a disability or not, God can use every single person. And that is just something that we need to be aware of. But I'm so proud of you for taking that big step and sharing with the deaf person there, getting to meet them and trying to love on them. Like that is so cool, and so grateful for the ways God opens
Thanks.
opportunities for us to be a part of God's kingdom and His story. So super proud of you for that. Number two. So, what is one thing that you wish the hearing community would know about the deaf community, deaf people, or people with disabilities? What is one thing you wish that the hearing community would know about that?
I really just wish that people would be able to understand that giving access to us, the deaf community, should not be that hard or difficult. We're just like the typical person, except we just need extra resources to allow us to thrive in church. So, yeah, I think often there can be a lot of misconceptions of deaf people, like we're too expensive to provide access, to provide interpreters is too expensive. Um, and therefore are maybe an insignificant part of the church or not important enough to the church. So, really, unfortunately, I've experienced a lot of church trauma and hurt because the church has looked down upon deaf people and not provided them with access that they need. So, I think some churches think deaf people need to be healed or fixed, which is not true, not true at all. God made us deaf for a reason. We don't need to be healed. We are proud to be deaf. We're fine as deaf people, and it's a part of who I am, our identity, and it's a beautiful thing that God has allowed for us.
Amen to that. Um, having a disability is not a barrier to being used or to, function in society. The hearing community in general just needs to realize that if somebody is struggling in some way, what can we do to help with that? What additional resources can we provide to help the person with a disability succeed? Whether that is providing for an interpreter, in a church setting or whatever it may be. because it's, deafness is not an intellectual issue. It's a hearing issue. And, if you can't make up for the hearing in one way, there are ways to help with that. So thank you so much for sharing. Okay, let's see. Number three, what does the Great Commission mean in terms of the deaf community or deaf people? And the second part of this question is like, so how are deaf people involved in the gospel?
Mhm. Yeah, the Great Commission is really an encouragement, a call to all deaf people to go and make disciples, to encourage deaf people to be more empowered, empowered to receive the gospel, to really internalize the gospel, and to make disciples. I have a good friend, Brandon, and he's incredible. He's started the Awaken conference, and it's amazing how that has been a starting point to really empower and see this discipleship message spread. Hearing individuals within churches have tons of resources. There's conferences, there's twice a year events. There's things that are happening for the hearing audience, but the resources for the deaf community are lacking. And so to have opportunities for discipleship training and empowering them with the message of the gospel and how to share the gospel. So fortunately for us, um, there's an amazing organization that Brandon has started called Deaf Millennial Project, DMP, Deaf Millennial Project. And that has the main goal specifically of providing resources for the deaf community, young, old, regardless of age, because we want to see the Great Commission happening among the deaf community. We want future generations of other deaf, future generations to understand Jesus and to not have barriers, where there shouldn't be barriers to Jesus in the first place. So if hearing individuals don't have obstacles or barriers, why should deaf people have barriers or obstacles to resources? So that would be one way that deaf people can actively be involved in the gospel. There's many more resources now than there was when I was growing up. I mean, I didn't hear anything about deaf vacation Bible schools, VBSs, or, I mean, deaf churches even. I had no idea any of that existed. It was years before I think I was in college by the time, or maybe even after college, I realized there were deaf churches. I had no idea. And I think it really starts with getting the word out, sharing about online resources and conferences that are accessible. I would say I was really lucky to be a part of a beautiful project called the Bible Recap Project. We translated and interpreted a whole bunch of 365-day devotionals of commentary on the Bible, reading through the Bible in a year, and resources like that and others that are increasingly becoming available. But that's just one of many ways that deaf people can be engaged in really internalizing and understanding the gospel.
Thank you so much for that. Okay,
Yeah.
what does it look like to not only have deaf people invited to church, but also be an active participant in church? What does that look like?
Yeah, often I see churches, think that providing an interpreter is solving the problem and that's all they need to do. When that's not just what it is, it's just providing interpreters. There's this sense of, are we meeting all of their needs? What if they want to be involved in different events at the church that the church provides? Small groups, for example. Providing Sunday morning interpreters is just not enough. We need the opportunity to be a peer, be an equal part of the church, to know that our voice is heard and understood at the church. I think really deaf people are just like any other member of the church. There shouldn't be a separation or even distinction, but more of a collaboration within the church of the unity between the body exhibited in the deaf and hearing community. And one, yeah, I just feel like a lot of churches are just lacking education about it. And if we were in the perfect world, I would love to see access to 10 churches, ready to have interpreters for me to walk into, but I can't. I have to pick a specific church, pick somewhere that's nearby. A lot of deaf people have to drive quite a distance to get to a church or to a deaf church that's accessible. And it just doesn't feel right. I just want to be able to pick any church that I want and not be limited to one particular church just because they are the one with the deaf ministry. So I think it starts truly with education to feel welcomed, heard, and understood.
That is just something churches in general need to be aware of. Um, but thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, you bet.
I know that for deaf people, you guys received your first ever completion of the Bible in American Sign Language in 2020. What was that like? And, now that the Bible has been, you know, interpreted into ASL, how has that increased your faith?
Yes, it was such an encouragement, truly. I was just blown away, like, wow. I mean, I just can't imagine how much more deaf people are able to learn and understand God's word. I don't think a lot of hearing people realize that sign language is a visual language. And certainly, deaf people then understand the visual language form greater than the English written form. So giving them an English Bible is not always effective. Deaf people would prefer the American Sign Language version because of the visual nature, the visual then production of the language and the language, seeing the Bible in their heart language. Even for me, I grew up reading, writing English proficiently, and even still, the Bible is hard for me to understand it in written English. There's a lot of big words, there's a lot of metaphors and meaning behind things that I don't always understand. But once I saw the Bible in signed form, it changed everything.
I've heard of this information for a while now. But just hearing it from your perspective, hearing you talk about it, it just adds a whole another layer of meaning to it. So thank you for sharing. But one thing I would like to add to this for our audience who is here today, you may or may not know, but the American Sign Language version of the Bible is the only version that has the full completion of the Bible in sign language. So, there are still other sign languages around the world who don't have a complete Bible in sign language. That should hurt our hearts. And, we should be moved to, help with that. But thank you for sharing. Okay. What lessons should the global church be mindful of in terms of interacting with a person with a disability, specifically deafness?
Yeah, so often hearing people when they meet a deaf person for the first time can, I mean, maybe feel some intimidation, understandably so, where often there's just maybe a limited access or to be exposed to being around deaf people. And I think it's important to be mindful and to make sure that eye contact is maintained during the conversation. The deaf person might be looking at the interpreter, but you're still looking at the deaf person. And if you look at the deaf person, um, there's value there instead of looking at the interpreter. It's an important part of the conversation that you, as the hearing person, are looking at the deaf person. So eye contact is one thing. And making sure that you have seating available near the front of the room of the church. Deaf people rely often on a lot of lip reading, visual cues, seeing the interpreter. So that space available, it's necessary. And that is an incredible token exhibiting your welcoming deaf people when that is thought through and done well. Unfortunately, um, there are churches who might reserve a deaf section in a location that's not in the front of the room because they might say that deaf people are too distracting. So maybe they'll put them up on the balcony level or put them in the back of the room. And it's hurtful. It's hurtful and it's not at all a sense of welcome that we want. So just being mindful of the actions that are chosen and what those actions reflect. Are they reflecting Christ? It should be welcoming and not excluding. And that's just really important to remember. I mean, learning some sign language is a significant demonstration of welcoming people. Being able to communicate in the heart language of deaf people is important and makes us feel welcome. Yeah, really, I think just engaging with deaf people, talking with them like they're a typical person, like everybody else. I know every deaf person that you meet is not the same. There's no cookie cutter as far as how their preference of communication goes. Maybe some speak while others don't speak or prefer signed or maybe what we call SIMCOM, signing and speaking at the same time. There's a diversity among deaf people. So just being mindful again, not to assume that all deaf people can't speak or to put deaf people in a box like, oh yeah, they're all like this and having stereotypes in that sense because really there is diversity. So yeah.
Love it. All of this is so educational. I'm learning a lot. Thank you for all of your wisdom. Next question. I guess this is more of a Brandon question, but I'm going to ask you as well. Um, so, what does it look like to be an ally for deaf people, for um, hearing people, to be an ally for deaf people? What does that look like?
Yes. This may have some overlap with what I've said already. I think really just making sure that the deaf community in your church is being heard. I think oftentimes deaf ministry can be neglected, looked down upon. And um, when it comes to leading meetings or the church making big decisions, to have allyship, to have collaboration in those things would be beautiful. To encourage the deaf community to engage in the decision making process. and just making sure that their needs are met. The needs for access and for full inclusion, loving them well.
Okay.
Mhm.
Last question. If my hearing friends walk away from this conference with one thing about deaf people or people with disabilities, what would you want them to walk away with?
Hmm. I just want them to walk away with the understanding that deaf people are just some of all of God's people, that we are all His. And the language of love is the language of God. So just love as a demonstration of language. For them to be mindful that we're just asking for access. We just want to know God's word in our own language. That's all we're asking.
The church I am praying um, has their hearts open to finding different ways to make access available for people, especially people with disabilities, specifically deafness. Things you mentioned before, like having interpreters, making budgets to hire interpreters for a Sunday service. That way deaf people can have access to Jesus. Because I don't think it has changed. But from what I last heard, the statistic, common statistic of, only 2% of 70 million deaf people knowing about Jesus, if that doesn't break a Christian's heart, I don't know what does. The suggestions that you made, like having churches hire interpreters, can help with the statistic of increasing the number of 2%. Um,
So, yeah, I wanted to add to that. Churches sometimes have a rough time hiring an interpreter because there's not a lot of deaf people that are showing up, but it doesn't matter. It's not about the numbers, it's about the impact on that deaf person. We're a small community. And if you're willing to provide an interpreter for that one person, that deaf person has the opportunity to go share the gospel with their deaf friends. So it doesn't matter if it's one person or many, regardless of the number, it's important that the deaf community at your church feels welcomed and accepted. And part of that is providing an interpreter. And that will help more deaf people to feel more accepted and welcomed into the church. But unfortunately, a lot of my deaf friends don't want to go to church. They're resistant to it because of bad experiences and trauma that they've had over the years, unfortunately. And we need to change that stigma of the church among deaf people.
I'm loving all of this information. I learned a lot, even though I've heard all of this information before. Just hearing it from you and just hearing it from your perspective, really aware that, deaf people matter, to the kingdom of God. You guys aren't broken. God didn't make a mistake when he made you guys. You guys have a purpose. And, even with the things you guys are doing, like with that Millennial Project, with, the Bible recap, like all of these things, you guys have impacted my life in more words than I can express. And it's an honor to be your friend. But thank you so much for sharing your story and, you know, giving us some insight into what the church, the global church, would need to work on to make Jesus accessible to everyone. Thank you for taking taking the time to do this interview. So thank you so much. And thank you so much, Araya, for your help. And you're amazing. Thank you so much.
Yes, love you too, and thank you.